it was difficult from the point of view of permits, but it was also difficult from the point of view of travel, because you would fly from Calcutta up to a little field in West Bengal, and as the old aeroplane circled a World War II comet, as it circled, not comet, a World War II Dakota, as it circled round and round, you'd look down and see a little boy chasing the cows off the grass strip, and then this thing would land, and you'd hope that there would be a jeep from Bhutan waiting for you. And then you would come in from there overland through Phuntsholling Soling and then up into the mountains to Thimphu and Paro. There was only really the one road then. And it was, however, a great deal easier travelling on it in 1971, because as I recall, the total number of vehicles in the country in 71 was round about 50. So it was very surprising to meet another vehicle on the road. Today, if you drive down to the Indian border, you're constantly having to avoid thundering lorries charging round corners. So in some ways it was much easier, but certainly you couldn't just fly in an Airbus. The fourth king instituted the first constitution of Bhutan, and under that constitution, Bhutan would become a full multi-party parliamentary democracy. The powers of the king would become totally constitutionalized, so that the powers of the king under the new constitution are less than the powers of Queen Elizabeth II in England. It's a fully constitutional monarchy. That is an enormous change for the people of Bhutan to understand. And one shouldn't underestimate how difficult it was for the people of Bhutan to accept those changes. Now, if we think about the fourth king had been king for over 30 years. He'd been seen by all the people as the fount of everything, the fount of all authority. He was the father figure who you went to when you had a problem. Now, under the new constitution, he is a constitutional monarch. The power now lies with the elected government. It would have been very difficult for the people to have seen the same man who for over 30 years was the fount of all authority, suddenly saying, well, this man now, sorry, he can't help you because that's the job of the government. So my answer to why is new constitution, new constitutional monarchy, new democracy, new face. And the new face of the new king has helped people to understand that now Bhutan is at a new stage of its history. I was teaching at a boarding school in Oxford, and I happened to go to a dinner party in Oxford. Now, going to a dinner party in Oxford is very dangerous because you meet interesting people. And I happened to meet a lady called Deki Leidenla, who came from Darjeeling, a very, very eminent Darjeeling family. And we chatted about nothing. She worked in England. And a few weeks later, she wrote to me and asked if I was interested in coming to teach in Bhutan for a year or two. And my initial reaction was, no, thank you. I was very happy living in Oxford, which is a great place to live. I'd never heard of Bhutan, and nor had anybody else. I knew nothing about it. I was not particularly interested in mountains or culture. After all, I was a physicist, a physics teacher. So my initial reaction, I wrote back and said, no, thank you. And fortunately, 2 weeks later, she wrote to me again and repeated the invitation. And so I discovered where Bhutan was from looking in an atlas. And I said, yes, okay, I'll come. But I really knew nothing about the country at all. And I really came here because it sounded a bit of a change for a year from Oxford. In fact, of course, as I now, looking back from all these 43 years, I now realise that coming here in 1971 for a year actually changed my life subsequently. in ways I could never have imagined. It's very odd. This tiny, tiny little kingdom has got a very potent effect on people who become associated with it. And I've seen this to be true of all sorts of people. And for example, I spent some years working for the Sultan of Oman, and my connection with Bhutan affected what I did in Oman. So it's a very strange, it's a tiny little stone that you drop in a pond and the ripples spread out. So there we are. I came here without intention, really just because it sounded like a fun thing to do for a year, but it had a very big subsequent effect. I don't like the word magical. I'm a physicist. I don't like the word magical. There is a certain atmosphere here. Now, you could say it's partly associated with the fact that it's a very beautiful country, the scenery is magnificent, but I think it goes much deeper than merely the scenery. One can think of many, many countries with very beautiful scenery. I mean, if we look at the mountain scenery, Scotland has got lovely mountain scenery. So, indeed, has Switzerland. There is an atmosphere here which is, perhaps you could sum it up in the word tranquil. There is a certain tranquility here. Another characteristic of Bhutan, which I've always felt, is a certain harmony. Things here are very harmonious. People live with each other very harmoniously. People live with nature harmoniously. Animals fit in with nature and people mostly harmoniously. I have 2 dogs and a cat. The cat sleeps on one of the dogs in winter. I don't mean sleeps with the dog, I mean sleeps on the dog. Mutual warmth, wonderful harmony. They will both eat from the same bowl of food. The dogs and the cat will eat from the same bowl of food. And that, to me, summarizes a certain harmony here. There's certainly true the pace of life is a little bit slower. In the West, you know, one plans ahead. I know where I'm going to be in 2 months' time on Tuesday at 6 p.m. in the evening. My diary will be full several months ahead. Here, everything tends to happen quite spontaneously. One characteristic of Bhutan is you don't worry much about planning ahead. The view is, if I can quote from a well-known English film, The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, great film, the view is everything will work out okay in the end, don't worry. And in the film, I think it says everything will be all right in the end, and if it's not all right, it's just because it's not yet the end. So I think this aspect of Bhutan is very nice and very relaxed. I think also a lot of visitors who come here are greatly affected by the style of the people. There is a certain ease of social intercourse. Even though it's a very formal country, nevertheless, there's a certain ease of social connection. So there is then that additional, rather like the quintessence, there's that additional element which some people might call magical, but I reject the word magical. But there is no doubt there is an atmosphere which influences people. And I think I know quite a lot of people who've been first just on holiday and then have come back and come back and come back and formed a deep relationship with the country. I'm chairman of a thing called the Bhutan Society of the United Kingdom. We have 500 members, all of whom have some connection with Bhutan. And the keenness and enthusiasm for keeping up to date with Bhutan is palpable. we have a grand annual dinner each year, which, everybody loves to chat and meet and yatter away. And the only trouble is we usually allow 1 hour for pre-dinner drinks, which can be quite a long time if you're offering free champagne. And so the chatter gets more and more relaxed. But the great unifying feature is their interest in Bhutan. It's a country that inspires interest, it inspires affection, it inspires a connection. Now, whether that is ethereal or magical or whatever, I don't think so. But it is quite a unique country. Well, gross national happiness is a very cute phrase. It's a very catchy phrase. And as you will know, the reason it arose is because the fourth king, when he was in his early 20s, gave a press conference at which a journalist asked the king, Your Majesty, what is the gross national product of Bhutan? And in those days, the gross national product of Bhutan was approximately $50 per year. It was the second lowest in the world. And this journalist was probably just wanting to put down Bhutan a little by asking the king to say how poor Bhutan was. The fourth king, however, with great shrewdness and quickness of mind, didn't answer the question. He simply said, I'm more interested in gross national... No, he said, I'm not so interested in gross national product, I'm more interested in gross national happiness. So we have the phrase gross national happiness because the journalist used in his question the phrase gross national product. But it trips off the tongue rather nicely. And this really was simply an expression by the fourth king of his sense of priorities in running the country. He was more interested in how happy and content the people were, rather than how many US dollars they happened to have in their pocket. And an English journalist once wrote that the fourth king of Bhutan, or the king of Bhutan, is one of the few world leaders who understand that the village farmer, happily living in his village community, working on his small subsistence farm, is a great deal happier than the same man working in a Nike football factory earning $50 a week. And so this priority for not so much for how many dollars, but how much contentment there was in your life was what the king was trying to say. He had no intention whatsoever that this should become a world new economic paradigm. And for many years it wasn't, for decades and decades. It was simply something which informed a sense of priorities in developing Bhutan. The king would say often that he wanted development in Bhutan to be at a pace that the people could cope with socially and economically. Then, of course, when the economic problems hit the West, governments were looking for an alternative to gross national product because the GDP figures were all falling, and very nice if government could find something to sort of balance that out. The fourth king, his simple little idea, has now become a topic of great interest to development economists and this sort of thing. And I always feel that once one lets people like development economists get hold of a simple idea, their first reaction is to make it complicated. Well, we have to go back to the days of the Raj, the British Raj in India. The biggest challenge for the rulers of Bhutan during the 150 years of the Raj was to keep the British out, because the Bhutanese rulers realized that if the British got in, Bhutan would become part of the British Empire, and they didn't want to be. And of course, had Bhutan allowed the British in, Britain always wanted to place a trade agent in Bhutan, mainly because they saw Bhutan as a trade route up to Tibet. Had the Bhutanese allowed Britain to place a trade agent in Bhutan, it is very, very, very likely that in 1947 Bhutan would have been seen as one of the Maharajal states and would now be part of the Union of India. So Bhutan kept foreigners out to preserve their integrity and sovereignty. And of course they were helped because on the southern border were thick, impenetrable tropical jungles full of wild animals, and to the north were very, very high mountains. So geographically, Bhutan was able to exist in isolation. Now, after Indian independence, of course, Bhutan did not become part of the Union of India, but as a separate country. But it had to fight a bit to maintain its sovereignty. And the crucial moment was in 1971 when Prime Minister Nehru of India agreed to support Bhutan's bid to become a member of the United Nations. And that cemented Bhutan's sovereignty. But Bhutan had preserved its sovereignty by keeping foreigners out. And that had been the situation for over 200 years. So obviously that was not going to change in an instant. Added to which, of course, remember in the mid-60s, the Chinese annexation of Tibet sent a tremor of concern all around the Himalayas and into India, of course. And India would not have been happy to see loads and loads of foreigners coming into Bhutan. So all these reasons mean that Bhutan's continued existence was due to the fact that they were quite circumspect about allowing a lot of foreigners here. Way back in 74, way back, Bhutan made a conscious decision not to have diplomatic relations with any of the permanent members of the Security Council, partly because Bhutan became a member of the non-aligned movement, and so it did not want to get involved in big power politics. Also, Bhutan is a tiny little country, not terribly rich. Bhutan couldn't possibly maintain embassies in China and in London and in Washington and this sort of thing. So it was a reflection partly of Bhutan's limited resources, partly a reflection of not wanting to get involved in, if one thinks of the Cold War, we've almost forgotten the Cold War now, but if one thinks of all the strains and issues in the Cold War, America and China and Russia and all this sort of thing, Bhutan did not want to be involved. And so much better not to have diplomatic relations, but friendly relations. And of course you can have very friendly relations with a country without having full diplomatic relations. The two don't necessarily go hand in hand. One is not a necessity for the other.